All right, another one of these fallacy videos and arguments. This can help us, I make these videos to hopefully try to help other people make better arguments and also recognize when someone isn't making a good argument and not falling for it, because, there's good arguments and bad arguments, and arguments that sound good but actually aren't very good. And one of the most common examples of one of these argumentative fallacies is the appeal to tradition fallacy. So that's what we're going to talk about here, mostly in this, we're going to talk about it in the sense of sports because it's a sports channel, but this is something that even if you don't watch sports, you can hopefully, watch and enjoy. So the appeal to tradition fallacy is essentially defined as when you say that since something has happened for a long time, then it should continue to happen that way, which, definitively, there are some examples where this does kind of make sense and why it can logically follow, but there's obviously examples where this is not smart and not something you should use, and we're going to get into some bigger examples, a little bit later on, but right now, I'll just kind of some simpler examples. One of the first that I thought of is washing your hands in between surgeries was a great one, where surgeons said, well, we never washed our hands before. Why should we start washing our hands now in between surgeries? But the reason is new information came out, so you should start to change things. Another example is one that I personally fell for when I was, a little bit younger. We're not talking too far back, which was the moving the field goal post back rule in the NFL. The NFL used to always have the field goal be kicked at the 2-yard line on an extra point. They moved it back to the 15-yard line for an extra point. Why did they move it farther back? What I thought it would make for a more interesting situation, because the extra point was so automatic. And I personally kind of felt like, but it's always been at the 2-yard line, and I like it at the 2-yard line. This is what it should be. This is traditional football. But in hindsight, moving it back makes it way more interesting. Still feels like an extra point. Still feels like you're going to get it, but there are misses. It doesn't feel completely like it's going to happen. It was totally the right decision, and I was wrong. The only reason that I felt a certain way was, due to the tradition, which isn't necessarily a reason why you should, do something consistently. So what are some ways that we can look towards the future and say maybe what are some examples that it's getting used incorrectly today? To me, some of the obvious ones, if we're sticking with the football examples, is going to be something like you build through the lines. So you got to build the offensive and defensive lines first and then build the rest of the way. I mean, how many times have we seen a Bill Parcells quote at some point when we're talking about football, which that might have made sense for a time, but, things change. New information comes out. And the reality is the teams that are more successful now are the ones with better secondaries and better wide receivers and better quarterbacks. Seems like you should build through those first. You could at least make the argument. I'm not saying that that's definitely true, but just that the argument of, well, teams have always tried to build through the lines and teams have always tried to establish the run, so therefore teams should continue to try to do it. Not necessarily true. All right, so I created a chart that I think will help out. So here's what we're going to do, and this is an easy way to sort of explain what this fallacy is and explain what examples of it look like. So the question at the top of the screen, will the SS McBoatface sink? That is the question. You have a boat, the SS McBoatface. You don't know if it'll sink or not. One person says yes, one person says no. Let's start with the person that says no, and that person who says no is going to be using this fallacy. So the argument is no. It's existed 10 years and never sunk. The data/evidence is it hasn't sunk and doesn't look like it will. That's the data and evidence. That's what we know. So the logic, therefore, is if it were to sink, it would have sunk/shown signs it might sink. That logically follows based on the data we have, given the argument of that it's existed 10 years and never sunk. So the conclusion is it won't sink. This is how you would make this argument, is you would, come up with the argument, you'd figure out the data and evidence to support the argument, or, typically you'd find the data and evidence first and then come up with the argument. But if you have to make this argument, this is how you would do it, is you would come up with the data and evidence next, and then come up with the logic for that, and finally come up with a conclusion. Meanwhile, the flip side is, yes, the SS McBoatface is a specific type of boat that tends to sink after 10 years. So therefore, you would think that it would be eligible to be sunk. The data and evidence to support this theory is that those boats tend to sink after 10 years. That's the data and evidence that we have for it. The logical jump you have to make is that this boat will be built similarly to those ones, the ones that did sink after 10 years. And so therefore, the conclusion that you would draw is it might sink. Now, to be clear, this is not to say that every single time someone makes an argument that is the appeal to tradition fallacy type of argument, doesn't mean that it's going to be wrong every single time. The issue is that actually can be one piece of evidence. After all, looking at history is a great piece of evidence. You should do that. But it's just one small piece of evidence, and this kind of illustrates that sometimes it can actually even be a negative in your argument instead of a positive. Doesn't mean that it always is a negative, just that it sometimes can be. It's one piece of evidence, but it's actually not the strongest piece of evidence that you typically should look for in an argument, which is why it can be misleading at times. Let's go to another example. Let's use a football example. The question, which I accidentally cropped off, is, will Aaron Rodgers win another Super Bowl? That is the question. And so if you're using this fallacy, you would say, no, he hasn't won in 12 years. The data/evidence is he hasn't won in 12 years. And again, that's part of why the fallacy can be tough, is because you're really relying on that one piece of data and evidence that isn't that strong. The logic is, if he could have won a Super Bowl, he would have won by now. That's the logic there. So therefore, the conclusion is he won't win another one. Meanwhile, the other argument is, yes, the Packers are a Super Bowl contender. So there's this extra added thing on there, right? That's a much better argument than he hasn't won in 12 years. The data/evidence is they have a great defense, great running game, back-to-back MVP from Rodgers. That's a lot of data that suggests that the Packers could be a Super Bowl contender and therefore would have a chance to win a Super Bowl. So the logic is good teams win Super Bowls. The Packers are a good team. And the conclusion, which is supposed to say he might win another one, not we might win another one. I am not a Packers owner, just a typo there. But that's the conclusion that you can jump to. But to be clear, this doesn't mean that you have to argue yes to everything. What it typically does mean is if you use this fallacy and someone else does not, use a completely different argument, their argument is going to feel stronger. But if you want to argue that Aaron Rodgers won't win a Super Bowl, you can do that. You just can't, you can't follow that fallacy. You'd have to come up with a different argument. You'd probably go with the argument of, no, the Packers are overrated. The data evidence would be, wide receivers suck, bad offensive line, and Rodgers underperforms in the playoffs. That's the data and evidence that, and again, some of the data and evidence you can actually disagree with. Rodgers underperforms in the playoffs. He doesn't in the wild card rounds, but he tends to in the conference championships. So, you could argue back and forth about that kind of stuff. But, the reality is the data exists, and maybe you could say that the logic would probably be more of Rodgers underperforms in the playoffs, but you get the idea. So the logic would be they're not good enough to beat the Rams or the Bucks, meaning the conclusion would be he won't win another one. Now, if you're, if you're on the fence about this argument, I think you would probably agree that the argument on the bottom of the screen feels a lot stronger than the argument on the top of the screen. Again, doesn't mean you can't look at history to, view this stuff. Every argument I made was strictly using, or I guess not every argument I made was using history, but a lot of the arguments I made were using history in that discussion. And the ones that weren't were, based off of history, like the wide receivers suck because they've sucked in the past. So we're still using, still using history and still using data and still using evidence. But the fact that a boat hasn't sunk yet is not evidence that the boat will not sink. All it is evidence that the boat hasn't sunk yet, which is maybe one small point you could put in the conversation of, then that's why the boat will not sink, is it hasn't sunk yet. But that's all it is. It's just one small point in what needs to be a much larger discussion for it to be an argument. So it's something that it can work in the context of a full argument, certainly. In fact, if there's no evidence to the counter, it actually might make some sense. For example, something I even mentioned, the wide receivers, for the Packers suck because they've sucked in the past. Allen Lazard has not shown to be a great receiver, so we're going to assume he will continue to not be a great receiver. But the reason for that isn't just because he's never shown to be a great receiver. It's because we have seen him show to be a not great receiver. If there was evidence to believe that he could improve, then maybe that would happen, but there would have to be strong evidence to, for us to feel that way, and we haven't seen that yet. So getting a little, inside baseball here, but that's essentially the argument, is that just because something has happened a certain way doesn't mean it will continue to happen a certain way. And really the main argument is just because something has happened a certain way doesn't mean it should happen a certain way. That's the main way that this fallacy gets used incorrectly. So for me, a great example, probably the best football example I can think of is, head coaches say, well, we have to establish the run. We've always established the run, so that's what you have to do, is get a great running game. That's what teams have always done. Just because they've always done it doesn't mean it's been smart all the time. And doesn't mean it's smart now, certainly. Things change. Just because other smart people have done something, that's some evidence. That's not no evidence. It's just not sufficient evidence. That's what I think. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from y'all. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.